The camera light blinked red, but the silence in the studio had already started screaming. It didn't begin with applause. No warm-up monologue, no host chatter, no swelling intro music to ease the audience in. Just that red studio light blinking silently above the camera live. But the room had already gone quiet long before that. Not polite quiet, not the kind that settles after someone says action. This was heavier, like the silence right before something breaks, or maybe after it already has, and no one said it out loud yet. Harrison Ford sat at the far left of the semicircle couch, one hand resting loosely on his thigh, the other gripping something inside his jacket pocket. He looked older than the clips they'd queued up for promo, not in a way that demanded sympathy, just real, like life had happened to him. And he'd let it. His jacket, soft brown leather with a faded collar, looked like it had its own story, the kind that wasn't for sale. Underneath, something silver glinted briefly near his chest, maybe a pin or a tag, hard to tell. But whatever it was, he never touched it. Not yet. Whoopi Goldberg leaned in, smile wide but tight, the kind of smile that knows cameras are rolling. "Well," she began, drawing out the first word like a breath she wasn't sure she wanted to let go. "We are thrilled today. Hollywood royalty in the house. The man who ran from boulders, flew the Millennium Falcon, and said 'I know' with more charisma than most men say 'I love you.'" The audience chuckled. Ford didn't. Whoopi didn't miss a beat. "So, Harrison," she said, crossing one leg over the other, "tell me, that pin you're hiding under your jacket some kind of aviation thing? Or is Indiana Jones moonlighting for the Air Force?" Now more laughter. Not raucous, measured, like they were waiting for his permission to laugh louder. Ford didn't smile. He didn't frown either. He just looked at her, not confrontational, just present. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached into his jacket. A glint, a click. And then, resting on his palm for the whole room to see, a small, time-worn pair of silver pilot wings. Scuffed, one side slightly bent. He looked down at them for a moment, then up. "They're not mine," he said, his voice dry but steady. "They belong to Reed, my co-pilot, my friend." The chuckle in the back row died mid-throat. "He gave them to me the week before we flew out. Said, 'They're good luck, but you probably won't need 'em.'" Ford paused. His thumb brushed the edge of the wings. "Turns out I did." The silence now wasn't uncomfortable. It was awake. Whoopi blinked. Her note cards shifted in her lap. Ford didn't fill the space. He let it breathe. No drama, no flourish. Just something real. And somehow, that felt louder than anything else that had come out of that studio in years. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. 2 days earlier, the invitation came in quietly. A flat email subject line: "The View would love to host Mr. Harrison Ford to discuss legacy, career, and character." No urgency, no warning bells, just polite expectation. His assistant, Marla, hovered in the doorway of his study as he scanned it. "They're not asking, you know," she said. "They're setting something up." Ford didn't answer. He just kept staring at the screen. "They want charm, stories from the Falcon, maybe a quote about aging gracefully." She hesitated. "You don't have to go." He pushed the laptop closed with a quiet click. "I know." That night, long after the lights in the cabin had gone dim, Ford sat alone at the kitchen table. The only sound came from the wind brushing pine needles against the window panes, soft and persistent, like memory tapping to be let in. He reached down and pulled an old metal box from beneath the bench seat, a dull green military-grade lockbox. The edges dented, stickers peeling, one latch barely clinging on. Inside folded documents, an emergency beacon no longer functional, a compass with a cracked lens, and near the bottom, wrapped in a strip of flannel, a logbook. Reed's logbook. Ford opened it gently. The spine groaned. A whiff of oil and old leather rose up like a ghost. On the inside cover, in smudged blue ink, Laos. C. Reed Wallace, 0711963. Flylight. Land honest. He stared at the handwriting a long time, then turned the page. One flight entry still had dirt stuck to it, the coordinates scribbled messily. The word storm circled twice. That was the last one, the one they never logged out of. Ford set the logbook aside and pulled out a worn envelope from deeper in the box. Yellowed, addressed but never stamped. It was his handwriting on the front, inside a single sheet, typed, half a letter. I should have stopped him, or switched assignments, or something. I knew that engine had problems. I felt it on Tuesday, but I didn't speak up, because I was tired, because I didn't want another delay. Reed trusted me to say something, and I didn't. So when they say he died a hero, I nod. But that's not the whole story. Ford's hand hovered over the bottom of the page. No signature. He never finished it. He sat back, exhaled, then said maybe to the cabin, maybe to himself. I left him in the air before he ever took off. He folded the letter, put it back. The stars outside were just starting to fade behind early cloud cover. Dawn was crawling in. Ford didn't move. He hadn't slept, but he wasn't tired. Some things don't let you rest, and some truths, he realized, don't get spoken in front of a camera, unless you carry them in first. The camera light was still red, live. Whoopi leaned forward again, flashing that well-rehearsed grin. There was an edge to it now, not hostility, just uncertainty, like someone waiting for a laugh that never came. So, she said, tapping her note cards with theatrical precision, let's lighten the mood, shall we? A breath. You've played presidents, pilots, fugitives, adventurers, and let's be honest, Harrison, you made grumpiness kind of iconic. A few chuckles bubbled up from the audience. Trained reflex. Ford gave a half smile. More of a twitch, really. Not dismissive, just tired. But I gotta ask, Whoopi continued, eyes narrowing slightly. Do you ever miss being that guy? You know, the action star, the hero. He looked at her, not sharply, just looked. I don't think I ever was that guy, he said. The room paused, confused. I played him. Sure, wore the jacket, fired the blaster, cracked the whip, got paid well to do it. He nodded faintly, but off screen. It's a lot harder to land anything. The audience quieted. Whoopi adjusted in her seat, clearing her throat. That's kind of poetic, she said, but a little vague. Come on, you've had this long, legendary career. You've been, what's the phrase, a symbol of American grit. Don't tell me you're sitting here regretting it. Ford didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached back into the inside pocket of his jacket and slowly pulled out something small, thin, creased beige. He unfolded it. The overhead lights caught it just right. A photo. Old, frayed at the corners. Two men standing beside a small aircraft, shoulder to shoulder. One of them was clearly a younger Ford, smiling, wind in his hair. The other lighter build, buzz cut, a wide grin, holding up two fingers behind Ford's head like a prank. Reed. Ford held it out toward Whoopi. That's him. Reed Wallace, co-pilot, real pilot. Actually, I was just the guy with a name. Whoopi took the photo gingerly, more careful than she expected herself to be. She glanced at it, then back at Ford. We flew missions for relief aid, he said. No red carpets, no stunts, just boxes of water and food and insulin, in places most maps didn't bother naming. The audience was still, waiting for what came next. Ford looked down, voice lower now. One of those places didn't let him come back. The words dropped like iron into water. I wasn't scheduled that day. Reed was. We swapped shifts. No reason. Just life, I guess. Or bad timing. He paused. I watched his plane fall from 3,000 feet through binoculars. Never told that part on a talk show before. Someone in the second row gasped. Ford looked up. Not for drama, just for breath. They want me here to talk about legacy, he said. Eyes steady, voice flat. But I didn't come to celebrate mine. He leaned back. I came to carry his. The studio lights hadn't moved, but they felt hotter now, like someone had quietly inched the dimmer up without asking. Whoopi shifted in her seat, not dramatically, just enough that it read on camera as discomfort, or maybe defensiveness. She handed the photo back, careful not to smudge the edges. So, Reed, she said, repeating the name like it might fill the silence. That was his name. Ford nodded once. Reed Wallace, he said. He used to sing badly while doing pre-flight checks. I told him it was obnoxious. He said it was lucky. The audience laughed softly, almost uncertainly, like they weren't sure whether it was okay. Ford smiled, but only slightly. It faded as quickly as it came. One time, he continued, eyes fixed on the space just beyond the cameras. We were grounded in Panama. Thunderstorms. All night. And Reed pulls out this old Walkman, remember those cassette tape inside, halfway melted from the heat. He puts on Springsteen and starts slow dancing with a cargo net full of rice sacks. A few people chuckled. Ford let the pause hang a beat longer. I told him he looked ridiculous. He added, but I never forgot it. Whoopi leaned forward again. Gentler this time, less host, more person. And you said you watched the crash. Ford didn't look at her. Not yet. I wasn't supposed to, he said. I'd already landed. Different drop point. I was waiting for pickup when the radio cut out. Just static. He tapped the edge of his thumb on his knee. Once, twice, then again. I climbed a ridge, had my binoculars. Thought I saw something move in the clouds. He exhaled sharply. Not a sigh. Just letting something go. And then I saw it. The tail, spinning like a blade. Silence crept across the room again. He had 20 seconds. Ford said, maybe less. And in that time, he tried to steer it clear of a village. Took the hit himself. Whoopi's expression softened. That's heroism. Harrison, he looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes weren't just tired, they were haunted. No, he said. That was punishment. The air shifted. The audience leaned in. Not physically, but emotionally. Everyone could feel it. Something had cracked open. Ford reached back into his jacket and pulled out a second object. A keychain, tattered leather, looped through a single charred dog tag. The engraving was barely legible, but one word still shone. Reed. I didn't tell his parents everything, Ford said. Didn't tell them I was supposed to be on that flight. That I convinced him to swap shifts because I had dinner plans. A few heads in the crowd turned slightly. A hand near the back covered someone's mouth. He held the tag gently, like it might disintegrate if he gripped it too hard. I told them he died doing what he loved. He looked down. That wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. It started with the soft rustle of denim against theater-style upholstery. Second row, far right, a man stood up, not young, maybe late 60s, wore a worn-out ball cap and a faded blue work jacket with grease stains that had survived a few washing machines and maybe a few decades. His hands shook slightly as he cleared his throat. Sorry, he said, voice gravelly. I wasn't planning to say anything. I just came to, I don't know. Watch. The crew froze. Producers behind the camera exchanged sharp glances. Someone mouthed, "Do we cut?" But no one moved. The man kept going. I was stationed at March Air Force Base, he said. Back in '85, I was a mechanic their jets. Cargo planes. Whatever they threw at us. Long hour, not much glamour. Ford looked at him now. Really looked. The man nodded, making eye contact. One summer, they told us we'd be assisting some Hollywood guy learning to fly for a movie. We all rolled our eyes. Figured it'd be another actor trying to look cool in a cockpit. People chuckled, not at him, but with him. But then this guy shows up. He said, gesturing toward Ford, didn't bring press, no entourage, just a beat-up duffel bag and a notebook full of questions. Sat with us on the tarmac eating vending machine sandwiches. He paused, swallowing. Didn't ask us about movie stunts. He asked us what it felt like when the engine cuts out midair, or when the hydraulics go stiff in a storm. He stayed late, listened, took notes. Ford blinked, slowly. The man's voice cracked. You came back 3 times that summer, and once. I remember. You asked if the simulators could mimic engine failure at night. Not because it was in the script, you just wanted to know what fear sounded like in the dark. No one in the audience moved. And I remember thinking, he added, this guy's either the real deal or carrying something he doesn't talk about. The man exhaled. After all this time, I get it now. He sat down. His seat creaked loudly, not because it broke, but because something in the room had shifted. Ford didn't respond right away. Then he gave the man a slow nod. It wasn't performative. It felt earned. Whoopi sat back. Her hands rested gently on her lap now. Note cards forgotten. She didn't say a word. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Ford leaned forward slightly, eyes still on the man. I remember the sandwiches, he said quietly. A soft ripple of laughter rolled through the audience, not loud, but real. Then nothing again, just stillness. And the feeling that something buried had surfaced, not completely, not cleanly, but enough. Enough to change what this interview had been, and enough to hint that this wasn't the end of the reckoning. Not even close. The studio felt off balance, not chaotic, not broken, just slightly tilted, like the furniture had been rearranged half an inch and nobody mentioned it. Whoopi was quiet now. Her hands no longer flipped through note cards. Instead, she held them together in her lap, fingers interlaced, like she'd forgotten she was on camera. Ford sat forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. He was quiet, too, but not withdrawn, just thinking. Then he spoke, low. There's something I never said, not to the press, not to the family, not to anyone. The audience leaned in, no movement, but the tension shifted forward. I wasn't supposed to fly that week, he said. I'd pulled double duty the month before. I was supposed to be on rest rotation, but Reed, he paused. Reed had tickets to a concert in San Jose, something small, local singer his girlfriend loved. He looked down at the floor. His voice came out like gravel rolling over regret. I told him I'd take his shift. Thought I was doing him a favor. Said I didn't mind. A beat. I lied. He looked up, but not at anyone in particular. I took the shift because I didn't want to be in the city. I'd had a fight with someone I cared about. I needed space. So I volunteered for a cargo run through unstable airspace just to avoid saying, I was wrong. His jaw tightened. But plans changed. Reed ended up taking the flight anyway. Crew shortage. Last-minute switch. I didn't even know until I landed. I didn't even check. A woman in the front row covered her mouth, eyes glassy. Ford's voice dropped. He died because I wasn't paying attention. No one said anything. A boom mic operator adjusted his grip, hands trembling slightly. Ford reached into his jacket again, slowly, methodically. From a side pocket this time, not the chest. He pulled out a photo, smaller than the last. This one wasn't staged. It was candid Reed sitting on the edge of the wing, shirt off, laughing, sunglasses crooked, sunburn blooming across his nose. It looked like freedom, or maybe just youth. Ford held it gently in one hand, then turned it face down on the coffee table. I've told a lot of stories, he said, about adventure, about danger, about beating the odds. He looked toward the cameras, not into them, just near them, as if speaking to someone watching. But this one isn't a story. It's a sentence. The weight of that line didn't land like a punch. It sank like a stone in deep water. Whoopi cleared her throat softly, but didn't speak. And Ford. He didn't cry. He just sat there in the stillness that follows the truth. It came from the farthest row, quiet, cautious, like the person behind it wasn't sure if they were allowed to speak. I used to believe the voice hung there, fragile. It didn't command the room. It asked for it. Everyone turned. A young man stood, maybe 21, hoodie pulled tight around his frame, sleeves pushed past his wrists like they didn't fit quite right. He was thin, almost nervously so. His hands gripped the edge of the seat in front of him. White-knuckled. He swallowed, then tried again. I used to believe in purpose, he said, in something bigger than me. A few heads turned toward the producers off stage. No one moved. The young man continued. My brother, his name was Elijah. He enlisted right out of high school. Said he wanted to build something. Not buildings, but meaning. Ford watched him, still, alert. Not with pity, with something closer to understanding. The kid took a breath, his voice shaking like a match in the wind. He didn't make it back. Got caught in a blast 2 months into deployment. I was 17. He paused, trying to collect the words. They sent home the flag, the boots, the official letter. His lip curled slightly. And for a while, I tried to make it mean something. I really did. He looked down, like he was about to sit, then changed his mind. But then the stories dried up. The people who promised to be there for anything stopped calling. And all I had left were slogans. Service, sacrifice, strength. His voice cracked. They didn't make sense anymore. The silence was thick, but not empty. It was witnessed. Ford didn't move, but his posture changed, not forward, not aggressive, just open. The young man sniffed once, wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve. And then I watched you just now, he said, talking about Reed, about the part of the story you didn't tell, about screwing it up, about carrying it anyway. He shook his head slightly, voice lower. I don't know if I believe in anything again yet, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to hide that. A pause, raw, unfiltered, that matters. No one clapped. No one should have. Ford stood slowly, not to make a point. Just because the moment asked him to, he didn't walk all the way over. He stopped 2 rows away, hands relaxed by his sides. Then, gently, his voice just above a whisper, then you're already doing it. The young man nodded. A tear rolled down his cheek, and he didn't wipe it. In the front row, someone murmured, Jesus, but not as a curse, as a prayer. Ford turned back to his seat. The gloves on the table hadn't moved. Neither had the photo, but something in the air had. It wasn't hope, not quite, but it wasn't despair anymore, either. No one sat back fully after the kid spoke. There was something suspended in the room now. Not tension exactly, but fragility. As if even applause might break it. Ford had returned to his seat, slower than before. His shoulders no longer carried armor, just weight. The gloves still rested on the table. The photo, face down, hadn't moved. Whoopi exhaled softly. It might have been the first sound she'd made in 5 full minutes. She reached for her next cue card out of habit, but her hand hovered over the stack, then dropped. The producers backstage whispered low, urgent. Do we wrap too heavy? Cut to commercial, no. Not yet. And then the screen behind them blinked. Once, then again. The audience turned. Slowly. That screen usually reserved for sponsor logos, trailers, talking points had shifted to black. Then, without prompt, a line of white text appeared, typed in real time. A glitch, maybe, or something more. I'm a Marine. Lost my best friend in Afghanistan. A pause, then another line. I was going to end things tonight. A ripple of realization moved across the room like wind across wheat, but I saw Ford talk about carrying pain, about not fixing it, just living with it. Ford didn't turn to face the screen immediately. He stared forward, breathing, processing. The words kept coming. So maybe I won't do it. Not tonight. Not yet. That last line just sat there. Whoopi's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. Her eyes darted to Ford, then to the screen, then to the audience, as if trying to remember how to host a show. The red light on the camera was still on. Live. No one knew who had typed the message. A staffer, a viewer, a glitch turned grace. Didn't matter. Ford stood again. Slower this time. Not dramatic, not on cue, just present. He turned, finally, to face the screen. He didn't blink. His face didn't twist into emotion. But something behind his eyes shifted like a wall quietly lowering. I don't know your name, he said, his voice low but deliberate. I don't know what you've seen, or what it cost you to keep breathing today. A long pause. No music, no cues, just his voice and the screen. But I know what it feels like when the room starts to feel too small, when silence is louder than screaming. The message remained frozen behind him. Ford looked around the studio not for effect, just to make sure someone, anyone, was still listening. You don't have to believe in me, he said, but believe in the fact that you're still here. And that isn't nothing. He didn't close with a quote. He didn't smile. He just stepped forward once, as if trying to close a distance no one else could see. And the room, the studio, the audience, even Whoopi didn't move, because something bigger had just stepped in, and no one wanted to interrupt it. The message on the screen had faded, not abruptly, slowly, as if the words themselves were reluctant to leave. No music followed, no applause. The lights didn't shift. The studio just remained. Still, Ford hadn't sat back down yet. He stood near the coffee table, looking down at the gloves. The old flight gloves. Faded leather. Frayed at the seams. The right one darker than the left, not by design, but by history. He picked one up, held it in both hands like it might break. These aren't props, he said, his voice quieter than before, but somehow heavier. They weren't wardrobe. They weren't stitched for camera angles. He turned the glove over. I wore these the day after the crash. He continued. I went back to the hangar. It was empty. Silent. I didn't know what else to do. So I put these on. Same gloves. Same hands. But everything else felt wrong. He looked up now, not directly at the audience, but just above them, like he was somewhere else entirely. I hit the punching bag until the stitching on the glove tore open, kept going anyway, bled through it. A murmur somewhere in the second row. Someone whispered, Jesus, again softer this time, like it wasn't blasphemy, but reverence. I didn't do it to feel strong, Ford added. I did it because I didn't know how to grieve, and anger was easier to wear than guilt. He paused, the glove still in his hand. His thumb pressed against the padding like it might unlock something. I kept these because they were the last thing I understood before everything changed. No music, just the soft creak of a camera crane adjusting angles. Ford gently placed the glove back down beside the other, then reached for the photo, the one that had stayed face down since chapter 6. He turned it over. Reed, laughing. Wing of the plane. Crooked grin. Sunlight caught in his teeth like a dare. I think about what he might have said if he saw me now, Ford murmured, telling stories on a couch, holding his ghost like a souvenir. He didn't cry, but his voice cracked just once, like a floorboard beneath too much weight. Truth is, I didn't carry Reed to honor him, he said. I carried him because I never forgave myself for letting him take off without me. And then, quieter, because I should have been there. The silence was thick, sacred. Whoopi didn't speak. Her hands rested on the table now, fingers brushing the edge of the gloves. Ford sat down slowly, back in his original seat, like the circle had closed. Somehow not with resolution, but with reckoning. The lights felt cooler now, not softer, just honest. And in that space, the gloves weren't artifacts of loss anymore. They were proof that some things aren't meant to be healed, only carried. No one had moved for a while, not the audience, not Whoopi, not the cameras, except for the slow, near-breathless dolly and the kind of movement operators only make when they know they're filming something that shouldn't be interrupted. Ford sat quietly. His hands rested on his knees, palms down. The gloves were still on the table. The photo beside them now, face up, a story finally acknowledged. Across from him, Whoopi sat straighter than she had in earlier segments, but she didn't look like a host anymore. She looked like someone trying to catch up with a moment that had outgrown the format. She spoke, finally carefully. "You didn't come here to be forgiven. Did you?" Ford looked over. His gaze wasn't sharp, wasn't soft. It just was. "No," he said, "I didn't come for that." A pause. One that didn't need to be filled, but he filled it anyway. "I came because someone might be watching. Someone carrying something too heavy to say out loud. I wanted them to know they're not crazy for still feeling it." Whoopi blinked. No retort. Just the tiniest nod. The studio remained silent. The kind of silence you don't break with music or credits. The kind you leave untouched. Ford reached forward and slid the gloves across the table, not dramatically, just far enough that they sat between them. "I've spent a lot of years thinking pain would eventually leave if I just stayed quiet enough," he said. "Turns out, silence just gives it better echo." A woman in the audience covered her mouth, not crying, but close. Ford leaned back, exhaled. "You know," he said, almost to himself, "pilots don't always land. Sometimes they just run out of sky." He let that sit for a beat too long, then followed it up not to fix the moment, but to finish it. "But we don't stop being pilots." The crew backstage had frozen the feed. Not cutting, just holding. No outro, no cut to commercial, just the moment. Ford looked once more at the gloves, then at the screen behind the audience. It was black again now, no text, no mistake, just blank space. Finally, he stood, slow, measured. His legs weren't tired, but you could tell the weight was real. He looked at Whoopi. She didn't speak, just reached forward not to shake his hand, but to gently touch the edge of the gloves. She looked at him, voice quieter than it had been all show. "What now?" Ford didn't answer right away. Then, simply, "I don't think we land." A pause. "I think we endure." And with that, he turned. Not dramatically, not in slow motion. Just a man walking off a stage that had, for once, allowed a little truth through. The gloves remained. So did the silence. Not the heavy kind, the holy kind. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.